It's time for today's Media Watch now, and for that we are joined in the studio by James Creedon. It's good to see
Laura.
you, James. And we're going to start with Yemen. Our top story, Saudi Arabia is under pressure to stop bombing civilians in that country. 14 million people on the brink of famine as that war continues for a third year. You've been looking at some of the reaction.
In particular, a New York Times article that got a lot of shares. I'm sure you've seen it going around on social media as well. That this really hit home because of the images being so striking. But first, a tweet from Nicholas Kristof, also of the New York Times, going back to August. The timing of this is interesting, and we'll get to it in a second, but this is prior to the Khashoggi affair. US and UK complicity in the Saudi-UAE war in Yemen is a disgrace. We in the West are playing a role in Yemen parallel to the role Russia plays in Syria. We are facilitating war crimes. So these sort of criticisms were being made, but I suppose you know, not really necessarily having an impact. A lot of people not necessarily willing to pay a huge amount of attention to what was going on in Yemen, despite, you know, ongoing coverage of some description or other. But this article by Declan Walsh of the New York Times, photographs by Tyler Hicks, really hit home.
Really
and in particular because of the images of the children who are malnourished. And as you said, statistics saying that up to 13, 14 million people could now be facing starvation in the country in the next few months. And that is a 7-year-old girl, Amal Hussein. We'll get back to another aspect of that story in a moment, but just the actual content of that article. The fighting has displaced about 1 million Yemenis. It's one of these nice multimedia pieces that they do now in the New York Times sometimes, where it's not just text and accompanying photos, it's much more sort of multimedia. Airstrikes have destroyed homes in the old city of Sana'a in its 44th month now, that conflict. And I suppose to get to the point that I was going to bring up, we're surprised, said the New York Times, well, this is a quote from a doctor in Yemen. We're surprised the Khashoggi case is getting so much attention while millions of Yemeni children are suffering. A doctor said nobody gives a damn about them. I suppose this is the way news stories evolve sometimes. It's not, there is no sort of law about, you know, equal coverage.
Yeah,
and sometimes it can absolutely look very unfair, the amount of time spent on one story, one person, when you have millions in all sorts of difficulties. This is a cartoon that I saw doing the rounds of Facebook as well, kind of pointing to that contrast in coverage, or the imbalance, if you like, in coverage. Yemen on the one hand. I suppose people have fatigue as well of hearing about these atrocities, and Khashoggi, the grisly and all as the case was, it had almost a kind of it had a narrative quality that I think drew people in, and they were interested in it just because of all the twists and turns.
And of course, he worked for the Washington Post. He was,
that's right,
and a US resident as well. That's
right, and the story is more easy to. It's easier to relate to because it's about one person who has a face, who has a story, who has an identity. And I
such
think
a bizarre turn of events as
that's right. And I think maybe why this story got so much more attention this time is a face, a name, and just human stories that will draw people in a lot more. And it does seem, according to a lot of the, well, not just reactions from the US and elsewhere, that this is now reaching a tipping point. This is a story in The Guardian today. Khashoggi merger may be a tipping point in Yemen's agony. Claims of the complicity of the autocratic Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the murder of the Washington Post columnist has weakened the chief architect of the war in Yemen and opened a new space for diplomats in which to operate. Indeed, France as well has basically stopped being in a kind of a position of prudence, and the Minister of the Armed Forces came out in the last 24 hours to say as well that things will have to move.
Well, the US is essentially saying both sides, Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels, need to get back around the table.
Exactly, but
the exiled government.
Don't have much time to go into this piece, but the problem is, do they want to sit down? That's the issue.
Well, the Houthis didn't turn up last time,
and it looks like both sides still seem to think that continuing the fight is in their interest. And this is a piece by a researcher who's been living in Yemen for 15 years, and she says for now it doesn't look like either side wants peace. Yeah,
well, they're just calling for a ceasefire right now, so some hope for that. Anyway, should we talk about the New York Times being censored on Facebook? What about that?
I suppose it's not as important in the overall scheme of things, but when this article came out on Friday last week, for a number of hours it was taken offline when people were sharing it on Facebook, and the reason being a child who was nude contravened the guidelines of Facebook, which is, I suppose, to miss the point entirely. But in any case, you did have a lot of humanitarian organisations such as this one here saying Facebook is censoring an important news article about conflict and hunger in Yemen because it is illustrated by a photo of a malnourished 7-year-old. The New York Times itself, one of their spokespeople, said that this was incredibly disappointing. The story is a stunning example of exactly the kind of work from some of the very few journalists on the ground that we need to kind of get out there. So they were very much arguing that that shouldn't ever have been taken down from people's social media feeds.
Absolutely. James, we have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed,
Thanks, Laura.
James Creedon.